Hello and welcome to Train Signal. This is video number 13, Networking in Linux Part 2. Part of Fast Track CBT Video, Linux Networking and Administration. So in this video, we'll be talking about how to configure a network interface card using the CLI. We'll learn about how to use and configure Linux log files, and then the basics of Linux domain name resolution. So let's start off with how to configure a network interface card using the CLI. Linux Plus Objective 3.7 specifically mentions that this is important to Linux Plus candidates. So as we mentioned before, the ifconfig or ifconfig command is the command you use to configure your NIC from the command line. After the ifconfig command, you can specify up or down. You also have to specify the interface, of course. So right here, here's our example, ifconfig Ethernet 0 192.168.1.104. That's the IP address that we're changing to. And then here's our new net mask. And then at the end, make sure you have this on there, up. It brings the interface up. So that's how you change your IP address of your Ethernet 0 interface. Now you don't add a default route or DNS servers with ifconfig. To add a default route, you use the route add command right here. And there's a specific command line interface switch here that says default gateway. So make sure that you use that route add default gateway to make this the new default gateway. There's the IP address, and then there's the interface that it goes on. So that's how you add a default route in Linux. And then to configure your DNS servers, you edit the host.conf file, which is the file that tells the Linux server if it should use the local host or the DNS server and in what order. And then you edit the resolve.conf file, which is where you would put the IP addresses of your DNS servers. Now, some other things you can do with ifconfig are change your hardware address, put your interface into promiscuous mode. That's used by packet sniffers so that you can use tools like Ethereal and you can see all the packets going across the network. Or you add a secondary IP address on your interface. And by the way, ifconfig-a will show interfaces that are in a down state. If you just type ifconfig, it only shows you interfaces that are up. So that's how you use ifconfig to configure your network interface card from a command line. In my opinion, of course, it's easier just to go in and use the GUI tools and not have to do all this typing and get the syntax exactly right. But for the Linux Plus exam, this is an important thing to understand and know how it works. So with that, we can move on to our next topic. So Linux Plus Objective 3.10 says configure log files, and it says, for example, syslog and remote log file storage. Now, Linux logs a great deal of information by default. If you want more information, you can go in and increase the logging verbosity all the way up to debug, which would give you just a ton of information. However, you would only want to do that if you're really trying to debug some application or program that's having a lot of problem. And you should be able to turn on debug just for that one program. For example, the mail server. You could turn on debug just to see everything that's going on with it to try to figure out, what's going wrong. Now, Linux servers have a specialized daemon just for logging. That logging daemon is called syslogd, or the system logging daemon. A lot of people just call it syslog. Now what syslogd can do is provide you a centralized repository of all log files from all Linux servers. Plus, these log files are stored in a consistent way. So no matter what the application was that generated the log entry, the entry that's in there looks the same as all the others. It's in a standard format. And you can even put in your own system logging entries yourself if you wanted to, or send system logging entries from like scripts, that generate either successful completion of a script or a failure of a script. Now the syslog package is called sysklogd, and the klogd program usually runs with syslogd. Now there are other system logging programs. If you don't want to use syslogd, there's syslog-ng and metalog, and those are great logging programs, but syslog works fine as well. Now the idea behind syslog is to have a single system log file. The system log daemon is configured with the etc syslog.conf file, and this file is laid out in this format. It looks like this. You've got facility.priority tab spaced here and then action. So the facility, that means what application essentially did this log entry come from. So examples might be like cron, mail, security, and then these local facilities that are essentially customizable. For the priority field, there's different priorities like warning, error, critical, alert, and emergency. And then once you get these entries, so say something comes in from the mail server and it's logged as alert. Well, then you have an action. What's the syslog daemon supposed to do? Should it just log that to a console, to the screen? Should it run a script? Should it send an email? Should it just put it in the file and do nothing? You know, so for every one of these different server applications and every one of these different priorities, there are different actions for the syslog daemon to take. Now, syslogd can also send all log output to a remote syslog server. So besides just centralizing all that log output on one server, there's also security benefits. So because you're getting the log information off of this server onto some other secure, more secure server, you could make that just your system logging server, and only root, let's say, has permission to get into it. Now, because over time log files can become quite large, Linux has a built-in log rotation system. This is called log rotate. It's a program that rotates the logs and gets rid of the old stuff essentially. And it's configured with etc logrotate.conf. Now, some programs don't use syslog. For example, Samba stores information in var log Samba. So you need to know that. Now, log files are excellent for troubleshooting slow performance and server reboots. However, you should be monitoring log files each day to find suspicious activity and prevent system failures. So here are some commands you can use to help you browse the log files. First off, the head command. Head -n is the number of lines and then the log file. So this would tell you the first 10 lines in the name of the log file that you specify. Then there's tail. Tail will tell you with this command, the -n20, the last 20 lines in the log file. Tail -f, and then a log file here, it will continuously monitor that log file. It'll just stay on your screen, and anytime something new shows up in that log file, at the end of it, it'll show you what it was. So that's pretty cool if you want to just sit there and monitor a log file. And then there's less log file, which will scroll through the log file and give you like search capabilities. And then of course there's grep. Grep is always great to find things in log files. So you cat out a log file and you grep for a certain line, let's say. Now, there are also centralized GUI syslog monitoring tools. Many are even free. So you can have a GUI tool that does these types of things for you as well. And that might be something to consider if you're really serious about centralizing your system logging all onto one system. So now let's move on to our next topic, and that is the basics of Linux domain name resolution. Linux Plus Objective 3.6 says implement DNS and describe how it works. For example, etc hosts, etc host.conf, etc resolve.conf, then these commands, dig, host, and named. So we're going to look at those now. Now, in video number 17, we'll be creating a fully functioning DNS server. So this is only here to serve as an introduction to DNS in Linux, not a full education on how DNS works. Now, we said that DNS is used to resolve IP addresses to host names and host names to IP addresses. So here are some important DNS related files. First off, etc hosts. etc hosts is the local host file. So for just your server, just your system, in this file you put in a host name and an IP address. So it's used to resolve host names to IP address, but it has to be manually updated just on your server. Now, etsyhost.conf, this file, is the local lookup order. So in this file by default you have files, then DNS. So the files represents the Etsy host file. So first, for DNS resolution, your server is going to go to the Etsy host file, then it's going to go to DNS. So if you wanted to change this order or remove one of those two services, you could in the host.conf. Now the etsyresolve.conf is the DNS search domain. So if I just type in PC1, ping PC1, it has to look that up in DNS. Well, it really needs a DNS domain at the end of that. So pc1.bigskyfishingsupply.com. Well, you don't have to put in that whole bigskyfishingsupply.com DNS suffix on there, but because what you can do is in the etsyresolve.conf you put that DNS search domain suffix in there. So in there you put bigskyfishingsupply.com, and anytime you type ping PC1, it adds on the .bigskyfishingsupply.com for you. So that's what the DNS search domain is, and it's located in resolve.conf. Now also in resolve.conf are the IP addresses of the DNS servers. So your PC is going to go out to these DNS servers and look up the IP addresses in their DNS database. To do that, it has to have the IP addresses of those DNS servers. So this is the file where those IP addresses are stored. Then we have three DNS lookup utilities. They are dig, host, and NSLookup. Each of these has their own functionality, but in general they're all used to look up DNS information and to go to a DNS server and say, what's the IP address for this host name? And a lot of them will do a lot more than just that. And then finally, the named is the name daemon, the DNS name server daemon. So if you're running DNS on your server, you're providing DNS services for other systems on the network, you're going to be running the name daemon, the named. So let's go check out each of these important files and tools. Alright, so first off, let's cat out the Etsy host file. And you can see the Etsy host file by default is really small, and the only thing that's in there is the localhost adapter. So the IP address for that is 127.0.0.1. So you can see here it just maps IP addresses to host names. And this is just two different versions of the host name over here. All you have to do really is put in one. So if I want to add a new PC called PC12 on my network into the Etsy host file, I could put the IP address over here, 1.1.1.1, and then PC12 in the host name. So that's what the Etsy host file does. Now if I cat out etsyhost.conf, all it does is it tells you the lookup order for DNS names. So first it uses the host file, then it uses the bind system, which is really DNS. So first it's saying go to the Etsy host file. If it's not there, go to the DNS server. Now let's cat out etsyresolve.conf. So resolve.conf, you can see here, this is where your DNS search suffix is, and then here's where your DNS server IP addresses are. So that's etsyresolve.conf. So if you had another name server to add, you could add it in here. If you wanted to change your DNS search suffix, you could do it there. So now we have a few tools to check out. First one is dig. I'm going to do a dig on trainsignal.com. And so this went out to my DNS server, and it looked up here the IP address for trainsignal.com. That's an alias, and here's the server that it went to here, the time. And so it went out and it queried the DNS domain database on my DNS server that I have configured for this domain. So that's what dig does. If we do man space dig, You can see it's a DNS lookup utility, and it interrogates DNS servers. I like that. I like the sound of that. So let's try another one. Let's try out the host program. So if I type host www.trainsignal.com, you can see it goes out to my DNS server, and it does something similar but different. It says it's an alias. There's the IP address, and it gives the mail exchange server for that domain. So let's type man host. Host is another DNS lookup utility. It prints out a short summary by default. You can use the -A or the -V option. Let's try that. I'm going to do up arrow twice there and do -A. So this output here looks a lot like dig. So just a couple different DNS lookup tools. And then finally there's NS lookup. So you can see the NS lookup output looks a lot like the other tools. NS lookup also has a command line mode. If you just type NS lookup and press enter, it'll give you this little greater than prompt, and you can do NS lookup commands. And then finally there's named. Named is the DNS server. It's not running right now. We haven't installed named yet, or the DNS server, so I'm not going to show you that. But that's the basics of DNS lookup and name resolution in Linux. So with that, we'll go back to our slides. And now we can move on to our scenario. So in our scenario at the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company, you want the new production Linux server to have a static IP address so it can perform services like DNS, FTP, and HTTP. Of course, you want it to be at a predictable IP address and have a predictable name and IP address that always stays the same, right? So that's a static IP address. So to set up a static IP address on server 1, you want to use IP address 192.168.1.100, and there's a net mask right there. So let me ask you, how do you change this IP address? Well, we went over it in two different ways. First is through the command line. You could do an ifconfig or ifconfig, and you could change it through the command line, or you can use the GUI interface, the graphical interface. In my opinion, the graphical, of course, is easier because you don't have to mess with getting the command line options just right. But of course, the command line has its benefits as well. So either way, we need to get this done. So let's go over to our Linux server. Alright, so over here on our Linux server, if I type ifconfig Ethernet 0, it tells me the IP address of our Ethernet interface right now is 192.168.1.12. It's up and running. So to change this, we could use the ifconfig command, or we could go to the graphical interface. Let's go over here to the graphical interface. And if I double click on the interface here, it shows me we're obtaining our IP address right now through DHCP. So we want to change that to static. So here I type in the IP address, and then I type in the subnet mask, and then the default gateway. I know if I go over here and I do a route, there's my default gateway right there, 192.168.1.1. So that's what we're going to put in here, and then we can say OK. And let's check DNS. DNS is still correct here. So if I go up to File and Save, it says save, changes are saved. You may want to restart the network services or restart the computer. Well, to make this change take effect, what I have to do is I have to deactivate, and then I have to reactivate. And then if I go over here and I do ifconfig Ethernet 0, Voila, we just changed our IP address. So we went from a dynamic DHCP IP address to a static IP address. And we're doing this because this is going to be a production server for the Big Sky fishing supply company, and they're going to have dedicated services running on this, like Samba, Windows file sharing, HTTP, FTP. So it needs to have a static IP address that doesn't change, when the server reboots or whenever the DHCP server tells it to change. So we completed our scenario. We completed the task that we needed to perform. And we'll go back over here to our slides. And we've come to the conclusion. So in conclusion, in this video we learned how to configure our network interface card using the CLI, the command line interface, and most of the time that's done with the ifconfig or ifconfig command. That just sets the IP address and subnet mask, and then you use the route command to set the default route, and then your DNS server IP addresses go in the resolve.conf file. We learned about reading and configuring Linux log files, some different tools to read those log files like head, tail, less, grep, a lot of different options there. And then we learned about the syslog daemon or syslogd, how it's a centralized repository for all system logging information. So it can be centralized just for this server for the variety of applications that are on just one server, or it could be centralized for hundreds of servers and provide centralized logging for every application on all of those hundreds of servers. We also learned about the basics of Linux domain name resolution. We learned about some different tools there: dig, host, NSLOOKUP. We learned that the name of the DNS server is named. We looked at the etc host file, the host.conf file, which tells you the order, and the resolve.conf file, which gives you the DNS search suffix and the IP addresses for the name servers. So with that, we've come to the end of video number 13. This has been Networking in Linux Part 2. Thank you very much.